Hello, this is Tom Gandley, and thanks for tuning in to my latest Freedom's Herald. It's been a while since the last one, and it's good to be back discussing serious issues. This episode will focus on the all-important topic of firearms ownership, its history in the U.S., and how that right and freedom is protected in the Second Amendment. We'll get into that right after this.
Have you ever gone through a hard time? If you have, I'm sure you have at one point thought, nobody understands what I'm going through. My name is Tamara K. Anderson, and I'm the host of Stories of Hope in Hard Times. Join me on Resilience Talk Network, Monday through Friday at 12:30 p.m. to hear the stories of other people who have been through hard times and come through with hope, faith, and some tips that you can benefit from.
The Second Amendment, of all the civil fundamental rights written in the U.S. Constitution, is second only to the 5 freedoms outlined in the First Amendment. In other words, it's as high as one can get in the Bill of Rights without being at the absolute top, and for good reasons. We'll get to those reasons a little while from now. First, I have to address a well-known panic-driven narrative in much of the media. There have been too many mass shootings in the U.S. over the last several years, some small, others huge, like the Las Vegas tragedy. Whenever an ugly, selfish, deranged lunatic decides to go berserk or tragically play God with others' lives, there is invariably the knee-jerk reaction to call for some kind of gun control, almost always in violation of the Second Amendment. It emerges from the ranks of politicians, leftist pundits, and the usual chorus of mouthy Hollywood bleeding hearts alike. The people, meaning the citizenry, don't generally know what long-term ramifications of firearms confiscation are, nor can they define what type of firearm is at the central point of the argument. For instance, when a group of young men and women were recently asked in a man-on-the-street type interview what the AR stood for in AR-15, many either didn't know or laughably answered that it stood for assault rifle. But there are no legal assault rifles in the possession of U.S. citizens, and the derisive comparison is one used by the fearful, freedom-grabbing, agenda-driven leadership, or useful idiots thereto, of today's left, and even a very small number on the right who are more than willing to sell their freedom for the perceived safety of a new, unattainable, firearms-free society. But that mentality flies in the face of the very framers of the Constitution. In the words of Benjamin Franklin, they who are willing to give up their freedom for a little temporary security deserve neither freedom nor security. I'm sure you've all heard that before. That idea rings truer today than it ever has, with one faction of our government diabolically bent on stealing your rights way beyond mere firearms ownership. We've heard all the scare tactics, the doom and gloom scenarios and hateful-sounding rhetoric, the worst and most telling coming from recent failed Democratic presidential wannabe, Robert Francis O'Rourke, whom you'll better recognize as Beto, having changed his name to act as if he were part Hispanic so as to gain a few more votes from the unknowing. He said quite clearly in a recent presidential debate, quote, "We are coming for your AR-15s, we are coming for your AK-47s," to the shrill whoops and applause of the anti-freedom leftists who saturated the audience.
Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. We're not going to allow it to be used against...
O'Rourke, like so many politicians, might have just been promising something that would get shot down in the Supreme Court. But his ideology is consistent with modern leftist positions. And if your state, and more importantly by far, the nation, ever goes leftist a la the direction of the modern Democratic Party with its O'Rourkes, Warrens, and Sanders et al., your right to firearms ownership may be all but gone. And believe me when I tell you, it has nothing to do with their concern for the lives of citizens. It's about their ability to seamlessly strip you, the American people, of your right to oppose a tyranny that some members of the government are just drooling over imposing on you. Did you know government tyranny, far more than your own self-defense, was the reason the Second Amendment was written? If the left's concern for citizens' lives was so authentic, they might be screaming a little louder about the U.S. population of homeless, which as of 2018 was around 550,000, according to the National Coalition for the Homeless. And every year, 13,000 of those die in the streets and in the fields of the United States, slightly more than the annual firearm homicide level. Shifting gears a bit, let's discuss the need for a Second Amendment. Why would it even be written into the Constitution as a prominent first thought on the minds of the Founding Fathers and constitutional authors? Why not just leave any system of defense to a standing army? The Second Amendment itself reads as such, quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed," unquote. That's it. That's the Second Amendment in its entirety, folks. It doesn't define what a well-regulated militia might be, or how they should exact their security on the free state, should it ever be needed, but the first words of the operative, or second clause of the amendment, explain the gray areas in totality. The right of the people. The people, the people. Not the police, not the National Guard, which every constituent state, and Puerto Rico has at least one unit of. The people. You and I are the militia. Either by conscription into an army headed by active duty officers in a time of national crisis, or a deputization by the county sheriff in a time of great civil unrest. You and I, as gun owners, will become the militia. We, the people, have always been the ones the government would rely upon to secure the free state of the United States. I've already touched on the primary argument against gun ownership. The belief that a police force, or, for larger local unrest, the National Guard, will be able to calm things down and restore order. For the most part, that criticism is valid. It would take a heck of a disruption of civil society before the police, sheriffs, or army would require us to carry arms and keep peace in our communities. But there's nobody out there on the left who could ever guarantee us it would never happen. For instance, consider parts of Los Angeles after the Rodney King incident. There were places where law enforcement did become ineffective, and those folks who owned their own firearms were able to successfully protect their own property. And regarding security of our borders at the national level, raising a militia for that purpose could someday be necessary, but realistically is highly unlikely. When Japan contemplated invading the Pacific Northwest during World War II, and it was seriously considered by the Emperor and his military commanders for a while, the notion was thoroughly abandoned, partly because of distance from home, and more so because it just may not be accurate to attribute the quote to him, but Admiral Yamamoto is claimed to have said, "There's a gun behind every blade of grass in the United States." There you have it. One incident where the people of the United States averted a potential invasion with their firearms, and they didn't even have to load their weapons and fire a single shot. The right of the people to keep and bear arms alone was enough to make a potential invader think twice and decide against that invasion. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. Let me backtrack a bit to the origins of the Second Amendment. The Bill of Rights is a compiling of well-crafted natural laws. Some might call them God-given rights, and that's okay. But this is certainly not a religious issue. In October 1774, in the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, George Mason, of George Mason University fame, stood up and stated loudly, "Show me a government in history that has never at some time stepped over the rights of the people." Later in 1774, 2 years before the Declaration of Independence, he also spoke eloquently of the need for an armed citizenry. At that time, too, there was dispute between Federalists and Anti-Federalists over the need for popular ownership of firearms, and other elements, of course, of what became the Bill of Rights. Embedded in this political milieu was the drafting of the Suffolk Resolves, which, amongst other provisions, called for the colonies to start raising militias. A few weeks after the agreement of the colonies at the Suffolk Resolves, the first Constitutional Congress was formed, and at that time, too, the representatives strenuously encouraged each colony to begin arming and raising militias. The colonies were defending themselves against the tyranny and took up arms against what at one time had previously been an amicable but distant government. The forming of the militias and arming of the common man was, and still is, justified by the natural right of self-preservation. Just to provide another quote from anti-federalist George Mason, who, when expounding on the need to form militias in the several colonies, spoke truth we have all heard before. He said, quote, "To disarm the people was the best and most effectual way to enslave them," unquote. Just as the Third Reich did to the Jews prior to World War II. Because that natural right of self-preservation could easily be taken from a disarmed nation. So when the U.S. Constitution was crafted, the drafters' understanding of the common folk's need to keep and bear arms became the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is, like the right to practice your own religion without government intervention, the right to criticize the government for its failures without being victimized for your words, the right to be secure in your effects and in your person, and many others, is a natural right, a natural law. One derived from objective standards that have existed since before the written word. Today's Democratic Party, which I rarely call it, in its embracing and overwhelming devotion to moral and cultural relativism, has begun to render leftist thought, in the words of political juice, subjective and ever-changing criteria and impervious to rational discussion. Rather, the argument against the Second Amendment has become one of emotional hyperbole, an exaggerated, ill-thought-out argument which blames the wrong reasons for a problem which has become overblown in its scope. It is an argument based in the emotional tirades of the moment, and subject to the whims of the narrative which drives it. When the party in power decides to act without reason or consideration of the people, and in the U.S. it will always be the leftist Democrats, then you can expect the argument supporting your right to keep and bear arms to be met with emotional outbursts, ad hominem attacks, violence, and in the end, the curtailing of your human rights, ergo the Second Amendment. The left hates debate, rational rebuttal to its ideas, and critical argumentation. Their responses to anyone, or any parties, and I challenge you all to look for this, counterclaims always devolve, usually right away, into a pathetic appeal to emotion, or they move the goalpost to avoid your critical questioning. To keep and bear arms is a right to you, the individual, and a natural law built into the security of you, the human being, and it is not, and never has been, contingent on, or dependent upon you being a member of some militia. Therefore, in understanding the context of the Second Amendment, the National Guard is not the militia, though they are commonly referred to as such. Rather, they are a branch of the active duty army. Therefore, our possession, or rather right to bear arms, is not time required to first be in a militia. Even the most liberal member of the Supreme Court and sentimental favorite of the U.S., Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her opinion in Muscarello versus the U.S., defined arms as any weapon which may be kept on one's person for offensive or defensive actions against another person. I paraphrase. Ginsburg made no mention of being in a militia, but you, as an unaffiliated citizen, have the blessing of reason and natural law to possess the natural right to self-preservation and maintain your resistance to tyranny. This was the foundation of the Second Amendment during the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. However, there still exist hostilities to the rights of men in modern times. What are some of the contemporary arguments against firearms rights? And how can you counter them? We'll be right back with the second half of Freedom's Herald in just a few minutes.
I'm author Richard Paul Evans. 20 years ago, we created the Christmas Box House to protect and care for abused and neglected children. Did you know we've protected more than 125,000 children? That's enough to fill every seat in both the University of Utah and BYU football stadiums. Did you know we've been helping the victims of human trafficking for more than 20 years, long before people were even talking about it? Did you know that last year alone we served almost 9,000 children, providing 12,000 days of care? That's more than 32 years of care in the last 12 months. Did you know that with more than 700 volunteers, we provided Christmas for nearly 3,000 at-risk children? Did you know that we need your help to do all this? This pandemic has been hard on everyone, but especially these children. If you or your business would like to help through donations or volunteering, we'd love to meet you. Find the Christmas Box House online and go to our website. And thank you for caring.
Welcome back. So, how does a well-regulated militia exist? What does well-regulated even mean? In historical context, which applies just as equally today, to be drilled and capable as a fighting man was to be well-regulated. According to the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, history has shown that when a government wants to control people, it has not banned militias, but disarmed them. A convenient myth, as we've already stated, is that firearms ownership should only be for militias. But we've already proven that you and I will be the militia if one is ever needed. The gauche conspiracy theory peddling filmmaker Michael Moore posited that the Second Amendment, since it was written so long ago, should only apply to, go ahead and laugh out loud at this one, to muskets and flintlocks. That would be analogous to saying that free speech is not protected on TV because they didn't know of TV in the 1780s, or that free speech can't apply to the social media because computers didn't exist back then either. Also, before I forget, a well-regulated militia does also not mean that the federal government is to be given any right to regulate or exact control over the men and weapons assigned to it. That would, at some time, allow the federal government to infringe on the people's right to arms possession, which the Second Amendment is clearly written to thwart. Then how could that militia provide any security to a, quote, free state, unquote, and I want to emphasize the word free? So in our modern era, with its fast-loading, rapid-firing arms, a free state can only remain free if the arms of the militia are on parity, or, in other words, possessing a similarity or similar firepower to all who may oppose it. Those events, which may someday require the standing up of the militia, include, but are not limited to, repelling invasions, putting down insurrections, and, most germane to the common citizen's right to firearms ownership, and thoroughly understood to be key to the preservation of human rights of natural law, providing the last line of defense against overbearing, destructive leadership. In other words, the Second Amendment's most important provided liberty is resisting government tyranny. Your right to be aligned with those who are willing to take up arms against the U.S. government, or maybe some tyrannical local government, should it ever devolve, heaven forbid, into a dismateria of government overreach, congressional indifference, autocracy, and authoritarianism, is that right by which all other rights remain protected. It ever comes down to it, and, with all imaginable abhorrence to the possibility, freedom of religion, the press, and the right to assemble and protest cannot be defended against an autocratic, power-hungry government with words alone. That potential is exactly why the right defined in the Second Amendment needs to be protected from the federal government, because a militia formed for such a purpose would need arms. Our right to keep and bear them was understood at that time to be more necessary to protect the people from the government than to repel an invasion. So where do we go from here, after essentially proving that all citizens in the Republic have a natural right to possess all manner of firearms? Going back to the face value, seemingly reasonable proposition that since the military fought the revolution with muskets, the Second Amendment, according to some Hollywood directors, should only apply to muzzle-loading firearms, basically black powder weapons which only fired 2 rounds a minute, if you were really good at it. The reality of this counter-argument is that there have been multiple-round firing guns for nearly 100 years. In fact, President Jefferson even equipped Lewis and Clark's expedition with the Girardoni air rifle, invented by Bartolomeo Girardoni in 1789, somewhat before the enacting of the Second Amendment. One feature of that groundbreaking design was that it could fire 30 rounds with a single charge, and was in service in the Austrian army from 1780 to at least 1810. Its reputation was strong, and it was well known at the time of the signing of the Constitution. Also, an American inventor developed a multiple-shot rifle, the Belton flintlock, not an air rifle, but it was able to fire up to 8 rounds with one loading. The shots were also fired in rapid succession, not all at one volley. So having those, and at least a few other multiple round firing weapons in common knowledge prior even to the convening of the Constitutional Convention, it's evident that limiting the application of the Second Amendment only to muskets or flintlocks was off the table, and the open-ended verbiage of the right of the people to keep and bear arms applied to other weapons of the day, and the factoring in of technological improvements in firearms over time. Why then, you might be asking, were only muskets issued to Continental soldiers and militiamen? Well, it's simple. The hardware of the Revolution, just as in every war since then, went out to the lowest bidder. Repeating arms of the day were just too pricey. Basically, history fails to support the only militias, only muskets arguments. But those arguments are generally made by the same people who continue to call for bans on assault weapons or assault-style rifles. But these people's arguments are unfounded. No particular style or make of weapon shall be discriminated against because of its firing capacity without violating the Second Amendment. To this argument of limiting gun ownership or restricting certain elements thereto, I cite the case of Nunn v. Georgia in 1844, when this argument was first made. The ruling in Nunn v. Georgia was that any law restricting gun ownership in even the slightest way was, quote, repugnant to the Constitution, unquote. That ruling also sets aside the style of weapon, going to some length to state that they are not just the weapons used by the militia. The Second Amendment, therefore, applies to us all and for all arms. Be reminded, please, that prior to the rounding up of Jews in Germany in the 1930s or the Polish military leaders by the Soviets shortly after World War II, the first actions against both groups was to disarm them. That heavy-hand approach would not work in the U.S., so the liberal, or rather leftist Democrats have to whitewash their ulterior motives. Never forget, quote, socialism will always show up at your front door with a smile, but won't leave when you ask it to, unquote. Why? Because they'll be the ones with the guns enforcing their will on you, the unprotected citizenry. Yes, I mean you. But like the swine in Orwell's Animal Farm, the so-called democratic socialists will try to connive you, convince you that disarming you is for your own good or the good of society. And all the while, they'll make certain that, like those same pigs in charge of the farm, the rules don't apply to them. Anyone who plies you with a story about how they want to take care of you is just covering up how much they want to control you. Fear, scaring the unknowing, is nothing new. It's done to sway the hearts of the masses all the time and on many issues, not just Second Amendment issues. They typically lie using one of the ways just discussed. The misidentify one type of weapon for another, for instance, calling an M16 mock-up the AR-15 an assault weapon or assault rifle. My question to you, the listener, is what makes any ordinary semi-automatic rifle an assault rifle? And is one of those any different from a semi-auto pistol in terms of lethality? Can a pistol be called an assault pistol? Or does the faction opposed to responsible firearms ownership understand that that just sounds too silly, despite their uses being purposefully similar? The first commercially offered semi-automatic or self-reloading firearm sold in the U.S. was the Winchester Model 1907, which sold over 350,000 units to the general public during its production run of nearly 40 years. In that time, no mass shootings were recorded in law enforcement ledgers. There were multiple homicides committed, of course, but not on the order that we have had lately. This begs the question, of course. Why have there been so many more mass shootings since 1967, when, before that, there were hardly any, despite the ease of purchase and overall access to a semi-automatic Winchester 1907. That Winchester 1907, in terms of rapidity of fire, was not much different than a modern AR-15. According to the Washington Post, between 1967 and 2019, 163 mass shootings occurred in the U.S. It is worth citing, however, that of all firearms homicides which occur in the U.S., less than 0.2% are from mass shootings. So, folks, it isn't gun ownership or access to firearms that is the problem in the U.S. at all. 1967 saw the mass closure of mental hospitals all across the nation. See a common link? I do. And the Second Amendment, enacted for both personal and societal security, must not, like firearms ownership, ever be infringed. Despite the harsh actions that come from insane or irresponsible firearms usage, a free society will only remain such while the people have every right, opportunity, and ability to exert their authority over their elected leaders. In the words of Thomas Jefferson, quote, "What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them have arms," unquote. Special thanks for informational support for this edition of Freedom's Herald goes out to Political Juice on YouTube for historical context and events, and Wikipedia, the free online encyclopedia supported by your generous donations. Additional acknowledgement goes to Brad Neufeld for editing and technical assistance. This has been Tom Gandley. Thank you for listening to Freedom's Herald.